So PC17 is have an understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's aspirations to care for country and how these inform architectural design.
Sorry.
I was going to say this one's the same at graduation registration and post-registration. So in 10 years' time, all the students that come out of uni will know this, but there's a bit of a knowledge gap that you'll have to pick up in the meantime.
Yeah, this is an important one that should come out of those conversations that you're having as part of your engagement, whatever that looks like, which is, what are your aspirations for this country? Our families and our communities forever have always had aspirations for country, and it's only been that there's been some disconnection due to colonial processes that any of those aspirations have turned into something else, which can be trauma, to be honest. So those aspirations for country, they still exist, and families still know what they are, and community groups still know what they are, and elders and knowledge holders, depending on how each community works, will have those. They can be very diverse. It can be everything from we want accessible housing all the way through to we want to be able to burn our country, all the way through to we want the water to flow again, to we want the children back to have playgrounds. And so it can be all of those. To know what they are, you do need to have a conversation to understand what they are, and to give space for those aspirations to come through. A lot of the time people want to know the stories. I'm more interested in what the aspirations, well, just as interested in what the aspirations for country are, because that I can design to and design for. In terms of the aspirations, it can be something that changes throughout the project as well, or that needs to be updated throughout the project. So it's something that is important to know early on. And it's also important that so some of the aspirations are for certain countries. So here in Sydney, there is some aspirations that's female led, and so you need to make sure you're speaking to a diversity of people who will be able to talk to that as well, and ensure that how do I put this? Ensure that there's enough people that are being talked to bring those aspirations through. I think it's also important to understand that our communities have been impacted by colonisation, and that therefore there is some fracturing within them. Unfortunately, this continues. We're not post-colonial yet, just to be really clear. We're still in a colonizing process. And unfortunately, while we're in a colonizing process, we're still being fractured in our communities, and we're still not yet able to reform as we once were. So that means that you need to allow time and space for those conversations to happen, to understand what these aspirations are and how they can actually inform the process. I realise that this is not often our decision in our space, and that means that we might need to push back on the timeframes.
I think if you're a person who likes theory, then a good place to read up more about what Danielle's talking about in terms of the fact that we're still in this colonial process is looking up theories around settler colonialism, which is a distinction that colonisation is not a past event that happened in Australia. We're one of the sort of countries that experience ongoing colonisation. And it's sort of, instead of being, well, it's still overt in some cases, but instead of being mostly overt, it's now mostly systemic. And those barriers, and changing this document is one of the barriers that's being removed by what will actually happen in the context of educating people to understand country in the built environment. So this is one barrier that's removed. There's probably about 57,000 others, but one at a time. But it's there's also a talk that Danielle and I facilitate called Deadly German, and the talk we had last week was part of Parla, which was about cultural sustainability. And I think that also goes to something else you were talking about, Danielle. There's this idea that maybe what the community's aspirations and needs are might not be to have artwork on a building. It might be that, as you said, it might be housing, or it might be economic opportunity, or it might be X. So the outcome of an engagement process might not always be architecture. And I think we need to embrace that as part of the process. Like, how can we facilitate opportunities? Conversely, it might be that you want markings of country somewhere on a building because there's nothing else that identifies this place as being a certain country. So it's not coming in with a preconception about what the communities will want, and actually educating yourself on what cultural sustainability is and what settler colonialism is, so that you have a wider framework of understanding of what the opportunities, and don't limit yourself the opportunities to be artwork, please. Sometimes it's important, but it's not the only outcome, and it's the most predominant outcome, which is why I'm bringing that one up specifically as a reference. It's not bad, but if it's the only thing, then when we're not being creative enough as architects.
I think it's often we get sent proposals just for artworks, and that one's a challenging one for us. I also wanted to just very briefly talk about consultation fatigue, because this is happening a lot already. And our families are exhausted. I'm exhausted. I'm sure Sarah is too. We carry a big cultural load, in not only as practitioners, but also because we work between culture and practice. That's the cultural load, but the consultation fatigue is a whole other thing. And that is when a community has been engaged over and over and over again, often about a very similar area and similar questions in that area. It's not only that though, it's when they haven't seen results from that consultation or changes. And so people go back and they ask the same questions, and they don't see change, and they don't see where their advice has actually made a difference. To be quite frank, it's better off to hold off a couple of months and actually make a difference, and then go back and say, are we on the right track, than to keep going back and over engaging, or to find different ways of engaging using different methodologies that are less exhausting for the communities. But I think consultation fatigue is going to only get worse until we start to address how we're engaging.
And how the systems can remove some of those requirements on traditional owners and accommodate them.
Yeah, clients have a role to play here.
I think we could talk about this one for hours, so we'll keep moving. So PC 27, understand how to embed the knowledge, worldviews and perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples shared through engagement processes into the conceptual design in a meaningful, respectful and appropriate way. So as you can see, this is actually picking up on sort of 3 of the PCs that we've already talked about, and it's now about how do you bring that through into design.
This is as much about understanding that you have a worldview and a perspective, and that First Nations people probably come from a different worldview. We might look and talk like you these days, but that doesn't mean that we understand necessarily your worldview. I often don't understand the systems that I'm having to deal with, and I've got a PhD, so you tell me how that works if I haven't managed to get through all of those education processes and I still don't get it. That means that my I don't know how to put it, but that means my perspective and worldview is so different from those the systems that I'm in, that I can't marry them. So it's about understanding that you have a worldview and that you have a perspective, and that yours is not necessarily the same as those who you're going to be talking to and those who you're going to be working with. It's then about understanding that your worldview may need to be tempered in order that they can and in order that those who are part of the process can give their voice to that process. It requires a different type of listening, and often silencing your own voice. Even me, listening in a different way, listening actively, listening with an intention to understand rather than respond. There's a lot of work that's done around this, and I think it's worth looking at. It's also important to know that every group and every subgroup have their own worldviews and their own culture and their own perspectives and their own ways of expressing their own spirituality. And these, while there are some overarching similarities, and it's important to recognize we do have those, we also have very different cultural expressions, and we can be as diverse as Europeans are. And it's important to know that, and that just because you've talked to this group here and they say this group here whose country you might be working on has a very different way of expressing that and understanding their country and understanding expressing their needs for that country as well, and their needs for the community.
All right, let's keep going. So PC 34, so at graduation is be able to apply principles and methodologies for, and at registration is communicate conceptual design proposals and associated information to clients, stakeholders, communities using appropriate and culturally responsive methods appropriate to different audiences. Culturally responsive, Danielle, what is culturally responsive?
Wow, yeah. So culturally responsive is literally responding to culture, but that in order to be able to respond to culture, you need to have a relationship to the people in that culture. It's about also understanding how visually we might respond to that, to each of those cultures, that they all need to have their own response, that the communication methods are independent to that, or sorry, relational to that and independent to each other or other cultures. And it also means that you may need to collaborate with others who can explain this better and work better with that community, and understand that community's specifics and their specific ways of expressing culture in order that you can respond to it. It is a little bit about humbling yourself and going, okay, this isn't my space as well, and knowing where you can step forward in that space, but where you need to listen differently and understand how to be appropriate. Part of that is about that cultural competence, which we were talking about earlier.
I mean, to give you just the simplest of example, it's don't put pictures of Aboriginal people dancing in a ceremony from the Northern Territory in a render that's based in Sydney. You know, it can be as simple as that, and it can be as nuanced as understanding which groups prefer to be called traditional custodians or traditional owners, where the like pronunciation and name of language groups, all sorts of things. Like taking the time to actually work with the clients that you're working with to understand how they like to express themselves. And, you know, for example, when we work on projects, particularly with groups that we've never worked with before, we'll go and we'll read their website and we'll look at the language that they use and how they talk about themselves. And that will be our first step. I want to express first step into understanding how we can be responsive to the language, to the aspirations, to the values that are expressed through their own communications. It can obviously go much deeper than this, but that might be a place to start. Okay.
It can be also just asking questions if you don't know. I'd rather somebody asked me and said, I'm not sure what to call you. Can you help me? And I'm very happy. I'd much rather they said that than to make assumptions.
PC 36. So be able to apply creative imagination, design precedent, emergent knowledge, critical evaluation, and continued engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to produce coherent project design. So if we take that as that step, it's the continuation of everything that's happened before, and everything that you've set up in all of the other PCs that we've talked about. And then the next step is this should be resolved in terms of supporting the health and wellbeing outcomes of country, which ideally you have defined and set up in your project plans. But Danielle, maybe now's a good time to talk about what the health and wellbeing of country means.
Yeah, I mean, look, country's not only the land. A lot of people think digging into the land is what there is is country. Country is much more than this. It's also the air and the water, but it's much more than this. It's all of the knowledge about how to care and look after and have a relationship with land, air, water. It's everything we know, it's everything we don't know. It's tangible, it's intangible. And this is why writing a definition of country is challenging for me. I find it troublesome because it's very personal. It's like any relationship. It's a personal relationship, and I hope you're all working on your own relationships with country and how you personally relate to country. Of course, for First Nations people, we're not separable from country. We are part of country. We belong to country. And so when you are, when we're talking about country, inherently, you're also talking about First Nations people. And the health and wellbeing for country is completely integrated with our own health and wellbeing as well. It's complex, of course, because these are separate and different, but also they are intertwined like a beautiful spider's web. So, and without speaking with us and without engaging with us, you can't possibly know what the health and wellbeing of country means. You can understand ecology probably and biodiversity, and yes, that's a small step towards it, but it's much bigger than this if you start to think about it as an interconnected web of everything, including knowledge. So it's about really understanding that in a deep level, and how that whatever you're working on is going to impact that. Not only impact it, but potentially, and we really hope, at least I really hope, improve the health and wellbeing of country, because so far, regrettably, to date, in the colonial process that we're in, that has not been, the health and wellbeing of country has been really impacted. And that, of course, means health and wellbeing of First Nations people. So this is where understanding our values and how our principles can inform a project is really critical. And this can be everything from, I don't know, in our projects, I don't know, maybe I'm a bit pushy, but we want to inform the project team as much as we want to inform, who's on the project team rather, as much as we want to inform like materiality and colours and artworks. And so the values and principles that come in with the community knowledge actually can be quite far reaching and quite, I don't know, interconnected, because that's how we see the world. We see the world in terms of our worldview in a much more holistic way. And so it's very hard to take the, the health of country away from the health of people, because it's just the same thing for us. I'm not saying it very well, Sarah.
Maybe I'll just reiterate something that we talked about the other day. Like, the answer to this is not biophilic design. It's not carbon neutral. It's not all of those things. They are components of a bigger picture. And maybe that makes tangible what you were saying, Danielle, and that like the strategies that we currently have in the built environment to do this are not holistic enough. So, and it's probably really important to say that this one, like, we acknowledge that you can't always engage with traditional custodians, but there's a specific line here that says whether engagement is possible or not, having strategies for how to support the health and wellbeing of country is essential. So that comes from your own education, potentially projects you've worked on in the past, understanding, as Danielle said, the values of place and how that can inform what you're doing. But at the very least, we talked about due diligence. We talked about not harming cultural material. We've talked a little bit about repair, like repairing habitats and spaces. These are sort of the building blocks and the baby steps of this conversation. And even in a project where you can't engage with traditional custodians, you can still do those things. You can still take responsibility for those things. So while it might not be the full shebang, and not many projects ever get to do the full shebang of properly designing with country or properly improving the health and wellbeing of country, every project should aim to leave country in a healthier state than what it was in when you started. 45. How are we doing for time? 106 minutes. Okay. So
yeah, another hour, sorry. 55 minutes. Sorry, everyone. I nearly lost you half an hour there.
So PC 45, so at graduation is understand processes for, and at registration and post-registration is be able to nominate and interrogate quality and performance standards with regard to selecting materials, finishes, fittings, components, and systems, considering the impact on country. Again, you'll note we talked about this earlier, you are assessing the impact on country for your project when you're planning for it. So this is the actualization of that, and the reality of the implications of the decisions that you make at every point along the project. Over to you, Danielle.
Yeah, it's about understanding that country has intangible aspects as well as tangible, and not forgetting that. We can, we all know that everything comes from country. Every single thing that we use comes from country. So it's about, of course, making clever and informed and thoughtful choices around materiality, finishing, fixtures, etc. We can choose that as part of our processes. But it's also about the intangible parts and how we're enabling and creating space for cultural expressions and cultural practices, which would then embody those intangible parts. It's also then about making sure that, I know that quality, certain projects don't have enough money to choose the sorts of materials we'd all love to choose every single time, but what difference can you make in every project? What difference can you make to the impact on this country in this project? How can you design so that the water still has a space to flow, that it's not being put through concrete and it's still accessing the ground? How can you design so that the footprint is touching the ground lightly and it's not flattening the ground? Those kind of examples of are hard ones to come around in some ways, but also things that we need to come to as an industry, where we're actually starting to respect the lay of the land, and that this is actually part of quality and performance of the impacts of country, and on the impacts of country rather.
And the sort of the supply chains one is really interesting conversation here too, because where are those materials coming from? How are they extracted? Are they you can't always know this, but is it culturally appropriate to remove trees from a certain place? Is it, how are they being removed? How is that land being cared for? And where does that come from? And does that supply chain benefit Aboriginal people or not? There's all these sorts of questions that you can ask. You could probably write 3 more PhDs on that one alone, Danielle.
I reckon. I mean, look, even if you can't engage with the First Nations community, you can find out where materials come from, and you can make better the impacts on country on every project just through doing that, through understanding where everything comes from. You can make decisions, that something's going to come from a First Nations community, which will benefit that community. I think I read a stat that for every $1 you put into an Indigenous business, $4 go back out to the Indigenous community, something like that. So we spend within ourselves is basically the what that means. And so it actually means a lot to spend money with Indigenous businesses and Indigenous communities. So it's actually, it's a big one, and it's an important one where even if you can't engage, you can do something.
I think it's important to note now that for everything that we've been talking about, there is a minimum that every project can do that's exemplified in these performance criteria, and then there's a much bigger picture. So when we start to talk about the health and well-being of country in its fullest extent, not every project's going to be able to do that, but every project can care. It doesn't cost you anything to care. Not every project is going to be able to do a whole of life carbon assessment or whatever it is that that needs to happen, but every project can be conscious of the decisions that they're making around where materials come from. So it's about understanding that these performance criteria aren't asking you to do the best case scenario on every single project, because we understand that that's not feasible. As Danielle said, not every project has the budget to be able to do that, and not every project is set up that way, but it's setting the tone for the aspiration for what best practice could be, acknowledging that there is a baseline, there is a minimum standard that we should be working towards.
We recognise that this is a big change and move, and every small step that you make towards this is a step. Like in our projects, if we can make one change and change one mind, even that's a win for us. So I want you to know that actually means something. Even just one move can be a big thing, and we appreciate that.
And then the last one. And then Kathleen, after this, I'm going to ask you to ask us the commonly asked questions that you receive so that we might be able to dispel some of those myths. And I can start off on that too, of ones that I've heard in response to this, because I think with change comes fear, and with fear comes people filling space with things that generate more fear. And I think there's some pretty simple answers to a lot of the questions that are floating around out there that we could address once and hopefully for all. But PC50, be able to continue engagement with relevant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples throughout all stages of a project and its delivery in a meaningful, respectful and appropriate way. Danielle.
Yeah, this is a fine line, right? We're not talking about you going back every 5 minutes to a community and ask them more questions. It's about maintaining a relationship, because if you work in an area, undoubtedly you will need that relationship, but so do they. They need to know who they're working with. They need the trust of that. And so it's about understanding that beyond the life of a project and at the end of a project, we need to be included in. And I often, can I be really open? I often, even in my position, don't find out the projects are finished that we've been working on until months or even years later. That's really harsh that we're working on a project. Can you imagine though a community member doesn't find out as well that a project's finished and they weren't there for the opening and they weren't invited along to have the benefits? It's actually quite rough, but it happens a lot. So this is about continuing that relationship and making it not just a transaction, but actually a relationship. And it becomes, I don't know, not a how do I put it? Not a consultation, but yarns with elders. And a genuine relationship with people, rather than something you have to do to tick a box. Yeah.
Maintaining the integrity of the whole entire process that you went through.
Yeah, right to the end. Even if the budget only allows for you to do something for the first few stages, even just keeping a nice email chain open saying, hey, we're opening now, can you come along? We'd love to show you around or bring you in. Anything to bring people in means something.
I would also caution here though that if you're, because this is specifically related to delivery and construction, if you're going through that process and you go through a VM process and that impacts on something that's happening that will impact on the integrity of the engagement process that you went through, then
you should tell
your clients that you need to go back to the traditional owners and ensure that the reinterpretation of culture through that VM process is still appropriate. That's just a word of caution on that one. But anyway, we could talk about all of these for hours, but maybe I'll stop sharing. And Kathleen, you would receive 1.5 million questions, but the first one maybe that I've received quite a lot is a comment around the idea that every student or every graduate who's working in practice has to work on a project that engages with traditional custodians before they can get registered, which is absolutely not true. The way that these performance criteria have been written, or maybe Kathleen, you can speak to this better than I can, but they've been written such that with an understanding that not everybody is going to be able to work in this space, not every project is going to be able to engage with traditional custodians. None of that's going to be feasible or possible. And also acknowledging what you said, Danielle, about cultural loads. There's not enough traditional owners to work on all the projects that everybody does to give someone experience and registration. So when we were writing these, we were very cognizant of that, and that there is no requirement here that every person has to have worked on a project with traditional custodians in order to get registered. Do you want to confirm that?
No, so a couple of steps there, and that's that intentionally when these resources were made available, the explanatory notes, which thank you to Danielle, who was a great oracle collecting all the information, putting it together, and the First Nations advisory group for putting the information in it. They are incredibly rich, huge amounts of resources, from videos to documents to further references, books, etc. Go in there. The actual explanatory notes themselves explain a lot so that you can find a lot of information. For students specifically, we have written it so we do not expect students to go and engage with Indigenous community, because that would just be overkill. It's student level, so at graduate level is all based on resources that are available to read and engage with. The point at registration, and for practicing architects for their CPDs. Again, the resources are great. They're really available. Not every project will actually have a reason to engage, but if you do engage, these are the steps that you should take. So the classic example that I give to somebody when somebody says to me, but you've got 8 performance criteria that are new for First Nations. I can't possibly do each one of them. You know, they don't relate to me. And I give the example of the final one, performance criteria 60, which is post-occupancy evaluation. And that's quite clear as to what you're meant to do. But, you know, in my 30-year career as an architect, I've never once done post-occupancy evaluation. So I don't have to, as a registered architect, prove that I'm ticking off PC 60 to keep my registration. So it's, how does it relate?
What are the other common ones that you get? Can we solve?
Yes, okay. So the comment that every project requires me to meet with Indigenous elders is impossible to do. What if the typical example is I've got a very small fit out on the 16th floor of a building in the CBD. Do you really want me to go and engage with the local Indigenous owners?
No, they'll be pretty upset about that. Probably.
Yeah.
But you can still be ethical about the materials that you choose, supporting Aboriginal businesses, specifying First Nations creators and designers in your process. You can still contribute some way, but no, you don't have to go and engage with traditional custodians.
The next thing is, for my projects, there aren't enough Indigenous consultants. So how can I possibly go through these steps?
Cultural competence is one. Building your own capacity and building your own relationships. None of this is going to happen overnight, and there's no expectation that that would happen overnight. But having, this is why I've brought up cultural competence, understanding that there are levels of cultural competence and you can build your way into that. And as you do, you actually create the space for yourself to do this work. Yes, there aren't enough First Nations practitioners, and we're acutely aware of that, aren't we, Sarah? I see Dylan's on the line too. But I think the work needs to start with all of you, more than the First Nations practitioners in the room or in the space.
But it's like when sustainability became a thing, right? Everyone scrambled and said, how can we do all this if we don't have all the information? Like, you learn it over time. And yes, sustainability is more qualitative than what we're talking about, but it will come. But you've just got to do the work. And we live in Australia, right? Like, this is the context that we live in. This is our responsibility. Like, the law of country is that you follow the laws of country. So if you're going to stay here, then it's worth actually taking the time to understand where you are in the deeper history of place and what that means. And once you do go through that and you move past the fear, it's kind of exciting, actually, like the possibilities of what architecture can be, what the built environment can be, and how it can serve country in some way that it's currently not doing.
I think this is where we start to talk about the unique vernacular of this place, of this continent, because so far I think we've not really nailed that. We've brought vernacular from elsewhere, but this is actually where we nail it. This is exciting.
It's quite an exciting time, you know, to acknowledge that in Australia, here is a culture that has 60,000 years worth of history. That's just amazing. That's nothing like anywhere in Europe. How lucky we are to have that, how unique it is. I know the universities are collectively saying this actually makes Australia incredibly unique and makes them a really great point for people to come from other countries to actually learn this. It's something that I think we'll look back at this point in 10 years' time and say, hey, that was actually a great springing point for us all. Okay, one of the other classic comments I get is, this is ridiculous. It just adds so much cost and extra time to the program. I'm already struggling to make my practice viable. This is just something that adds an extra thing to my day job and I can't manage it.
I think they should go and talk to some Aboriginal communities and see how they've been wiped off their country and how they can't make a living because all of the architecture and built forms that are taking over all of country. Sorry, I have to say that really bluntly, but you know, check yourself. Sorry, Caslin. But
I think the other part to that too is that not every project's going to do it. So I think that question probably comes with this sort of the exasperation of the idea that it's another thing that gets added to every project, and it's not going to happen on every project. I agree with what Danielle said before. If we can find out one more piece of information that informs the way we think about a site, then we will go. We're happy. You know, we've been looking at different data sets, for example, for projects when we can't engage with traditional custodians, and have been looking into the biodiversity atlas and understanding the species that exist on a site, and recognizing that, you know, we might be redeveloping an area or reshaping a project or a site or country, but it's a way to inform the client that they're not the only thing that's alive and living in that context, and that piece of land that they're responsible for in the development of is not just serving them, it's serving a whole community of living beings in the context of the birds, the animals, the insects. And, you know, it's an opportunity to design for them as well.
We actually employ an ecologist as part of our team because that's so important to us. So if you want to understand how important, because if you really want to improve the health and well-being of country and you can't talk to an Aboriginal person, even just understanding the biodiversity and ecology is a really important start. So we have an ecologist who we just now go and ask, even though we've got an Aboriginal heavy team, it's really important for us.
Okay, the next one I get is there just isn't enough information available for me on this topic.
Yeah, I thought that. And then I went and looked for the added resources for each performance criteria. And I found so many that I actually can't manage it. So that's why we're building a hub that's coming, but there's so many resources. So I thought that, but I'm just not buying it anymore because I went through the process.
So the first question I get then is, okay, I've got a new site. Where's the first place I go to find out where the Indigenous community is that I should be contacting?
Well, ATSIS have that map, which is not accurate, but it's a start. That'll give you usually the nation group and maybe a language group.
Also depends what state you're in.
Depends what state you're in.
If you're in Victoria, you'd look at the registered Aboriginal parties, which is available online as your first point of call, and then speak to the registered Aboriginal party. But we have a different context to Sydney, for example. So it's about understanding that local context. Sorry, Danielle, I cut you off.
No, that's all right. Which was sort of led on from what I was saying anyway. But I think there are a lot of places you can go. In New South Wales, we have Aboriginal. What are they calling themselves? Aboriginal corporations, and usually they are from that place or related to that place, and they'll have usually elders as part of them and knowledge holders as part of them, and find out who they are. There's the of course the Aboriginal land councils. That's challenging spaces because sometimes they don't agree with the ones who I just mentioned, and understanding that context is really important for your work. So understanding that there are contestations within our communities is important. This is often in the public domain, and just doing a couple of hours of research, you'll find a lot of this where people are saying we disagree, and a disagreement isn't a bad thing. In our ways, we have multiple worldviews and multiple perspectives, and if you can find a way to respect them all and include them all, actually you're going to have a richer project.
And then the last comment I often get is, I need a CPD on this. So here we go.
Got one.
Many more to come.
Yeah.
That's probably, I mean, Kate, do we want to throw back to you, or Danielle, sorry, do you have anything else that you wanted to say before we throw back to Kate for questions?
No, I think I've been contentious enough already. Thank you very much.